Okay, so just if you just hopped on, I just hit record. So feel free to turn off your video if you don't want that to be recorded when you're speaking. But otherwise, welcome everyone to this webinar for the Spare the Air Youth High School Grant Program. As many of you know, the request for letter of interest is open. And so we wanted to just provide an opportunity to talk a little bit about what this program would look like in this grant cycle and what the application and letter of interest looks like, and maybe how it's a little different from past years. So just as an introduction, my name is Beth Martin. I work with Alta Planning. We're a consulting company that helps manage the Spare the Air Youth Program. Also from Alta on the line is Anna Gore, who will be helping me co-facilitate and also keeping tabs on the chat box. So feel free to ask any questions either by unmuting yourself or by throwing it in the chat box. And I also want to introduce Leslie Lara Enriquez from MTC, who's the project manager. And maybe Leslie, if you just want to say a few words about the program or any sort of introduction.
Hi all, thank you. I just want to welcome everybody. I want to give a special shout out to Carrie and Daryl. I miss you guys. I just recently rejoined the MTC team and the Spare the Air Youth team specifically. I see a lot of familiar faces on the webinar, so welcome all. I will let Beth take it away with all the details because I'm still getting familiarized with everything happening with the Spare the Air Youth Program and the high school grant program specifically. But I will be able and will be supporting Beth with answering any questions that you have about the grant program. So welcome, everybody.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, so I think today, I know on the line we have some people that are new and some people that are very familiar with this program. So we'll try to give a little bit of an overview and then also just dig into some of the details that might be a little different. So just a quick agenda. This doesn't actually have to be that formal. So as I said, feel free to kind of holler at any moment if you have questions. But we'll do an overview of the high school grant program, talk a little bit about the format of the letter of interest and how it's different from maybe a more formal application. Talk a little bit about project and vendor eligibility and how to connect if you have questions on that. And then we'll go into a little bit around how to submit with the request for letter of interest and the selection or scoring criteria, and then finish up with just the grant schedule and kind of a look ahead. Questions at the end, but as I said, feel free to interject as they come up. Okay, so just a little bit of an overview of the high school grant program. This has been ongoing for the past couple years, and it remains one of the goals to deepen safe routes to school and other active and shared transportation efforts within high schools in a way that I know we have some more formalized programs at the elementary and middle school level, but the way that high school students engage and learn is different, and the programs also have to be different to support that. And so the goal of the high school grant program is to support new and existing projects that are happening and supporting high school students. And a new piece that came out this year is the creation of these regional task forces, which I'll talk a little bit about. And their role is as advisors within the process. They'll help score the applications that come in and may be part of the conversation of developing some of the projects. Also a little different from past years where the funding allocations were small mini grants at $10,000 a project. These funding allocations are not set, but will likely be around $30,000 to $50,000 per project. And similarly, instead of a one-year duration, the final grant year cycle allows the flexibility for projects to be either 2 or 3 years. So to have a little more time to develop and build potentially some new relationships in high school. All right, just a reminder, I'm sure many of you have seen this, but all of the info and all the resources are on the Spare the Air Youth website, which I realize is wrong here, sparetheairyouth.org/high school grant. I'll send it out afterwards to give you the correct URL, but this has kind of the purpose, the schedule, and all of the supporting documents that kind of get into the nitty-gritty contracting information, project eligibility, and some of the pieces that we'll talk about today. Okay, and as I said, one of the pieces that's new this year is that we've been convening these regional task forces to talk about, what are within a few different areas, what are the high school safe routes to school priorities, and how will they be changing, and where are people interested in that direction going. And so I won't read out everything, but you can see that there are 3 different task forces, one that we're calling Central Area. If you have a better name, please let us know, and that includes San Francisco, Alameda, Contra Costa. There's the South Bay Task Force, which is representatives from Santa Clara and San Mateo County, and then the North Bay Task Force, which is Marin, Sonoma, Napa, and Solano. So that's just a little overview of the program and kind of some shifts that have happened in this final cycle. Before I move on, does anyone have any kind of higher level questions? All right, so the letter of interest. So in previous years, we had asked for a more formal application with a scope and a budget, but given that we're in the middle of this global public health crisis, there's so much that is uncertain, and that includes, the next school year. And so this letter of interest, the intent is to identify and start working with the organizations and firms that will be receiving the funding or the grantees, but understanding that a well-defined project doesn't have to be developed or submitted along with this letter of interest. And so to that point, we've talked about moving this process, the planning phase, which will be developing the project scope and budget within the project itself, so that once organizations are identified and under contract, they'll have that time in the fall to build out kind of the details of what their project will look like. So to look at the timeline, so we're right now in this first phase, this request for letter of interest that we'll be talking through, and those are due June 8th at 10 p.m. Then later in June, that will be kind of all the scoring and the task force input. And in July, the grant recipients will be notified. And the big step there is that if they choose to accept, Alta Planning will work to get under contract with these organizations. Then come August and September, that's where the projects will kick off, and the grantees will be kind of working to do the planning phase and figuring out the specifics of the project, which schools or which students they'll be working with, and having some more flexibility in that way. Do I see a question coming in? Let's see if I can get to it. Yes, and so Amy was asking, can programs get funding up front to support staff and planning process? And that is the intent. So by getting people under contract in July, all of that work to communicate with schools or communicate with students, and all of that will be paid and supported through the grant itself. All right. So just a little bit about project eligibility. So the intent is to support non-infrastructure projects, specifically that are promoting high school youth leadership, and then working towards, some of these larger, goals of load shift and greenhouse gas emission reduction. And so I just wanted to provide, this is not a complete list, but some of the things that we've seen in the past or that would be eligible, things like youth advisory boards, bike shed programs, different student-led educational campaigns, either single day or multi-week challenges or encouragement events, or bicycle field trips. So that's just a list of some. And we have a resource on the website that kind of walks through a few other examples and the projects and organizations that have been funded in the past. So you can kind of dive a little deeper into that. And along those lines, some of the restrictions of what can and can't happen and what can be funded is due to the funding source, which is through CMAQ funds. And so there are some specific eligibility pieces around that. And I definitely welcome if you have any follow-up questions that you can email myself, and we can kind of figure out what or what not is eligible. But just to give you a short list, incentives are not CMAQ eligible, and those would be things like food or trophies or things that are of larger monetary value that would incentivize behavioral change. And along the same lines, things like stipends for students or participants are also considered incentives and are not eligible. However, there's kind of like this, I don't want to say loophole, but there's a clarification you can make, that is that certain things such as like outreach and marketing materials, which tend to be more of nominal value and might be things like stickers or pencils or water bottles, that have an educational message and are like encouraging and educational, but not of a large monetary value, are allowed. Along those lines, safety improvements, I was reading more about those safety improvements, such as like crossing guards, or the other example here is mobile radar trailers. Radar trailers are not eligible, and those are because they focus on safety as opposed to behavioral change. We might say they're related, but that's the CMAQ guidelines around some of the things that are and are not eligible. Let's see, so Leslie clarified bike parts are eligible. So if you are interested in like a bike shed or bike repair program, you can buy parts that are not giveaways, but are there to support your program. And that would include like bicycle repair pieces. I think there is a like Buy American clause that hits after you spend a certain amount. And I could look into that if you want to know more about that, but there might be some restrictions on where the bike parts can come from.
There is a Buy America, sorry, I was just going to say, there's a Buy America clause, but it's like a really large, I think it's like over $10,000 or $15,000. I don't know if anybody's going to buy anything that large, but bike parts themselves don't fall under that category. So it's really larger sort of capital purchases that would qualify.
Great, thank you. I know you're very in tune with that. I also just saw a question from Kevin around how tactical urbanism falls in the non-infrastructure category. And I think that's something that, as long as it's used as kind of like a programmatic tactical urbanism event and supplies are not given away to students, that could fit into like an event that's put on and falls into non-infrastructure. All right, great.
If I could just add, so in general, I would say yes, tactical urbanism, we can figure out a way to implement something like that using this funding. So my suggestion would be just to keep us in the loop on all the details of what's needed, just to make sure that everything that you're doing is eligible under the CMAQ funds.
Great, yeah. Just to reiterate, feel free to email myself if there's any questions. We can kind of brainstorm together how to make a project that you have in mind and make sure that it's eligible. So just a little bit about vendor eligibility. I will direct you to a 3-page document that's on the website, insurance and contracting requirements. It kind of lays out in more detail than I'll go through today, kind of the insurance requirements, worker comp, and things that the organization that's going to be the grantee will need to have to be able to get under contract with all the planning and design. Again, feel free to email me. Our contract people are really open to just getting in touch with whoever's the right person in your organization to figure that out. And we've had a few questions so far where it seems like there's an organization that might be interested but ineligible who's going to be partnering with another organization that is eligible. And that is a good way to kind of get around that funding mechanism. So again, yeah, feel free to reach out if there's any specific questions around that. All right, so just wanted to go through in a little more specifics how the submission process works like and looks like, and then what the selection criteria or scoring criteria looks like. Okay, so the request for letter of interest, you can download that on the website as well. It's 11 questions. It's not supposed to be too unwieldy, but just get a sense, even without going into specifically what the project scope and budget is, what you have in mind, and then also why your organization is set up to be a good fit. And then in terms of submission, you can just submit it either as a Word document or PDF. And the email to submit it to is info@sparetheairyouth.org. And just a reminder that the due date is June 8th by 10 p.m. All right. So I'm going to hop over to the actual document, so we don't need to read this on here. All right. Can people see the PDF? Great. All right. So as I said, this is 11 questions. I'll just give you a high-level summary, and if you have any specific questions, we can talk through that. The first couple questions, organization and applicant information, just basic information about who's applying and who the grantee would be. We're interested in knowing which counties you've worked with in the Bay Area and which ones you'd be interested in working within for this program. And then there's a question 6, which talks about, what experience your organization has working with high school students or on Safe Routes to School projects. And then question 7 is kind of the meat of the application, and asks a number of questions around how either your past work or the way that your organization is set up and delivers projects would demonstrate an ability to really meet these following criteria. And these, as you see, and I'll go into more detail in a moment, kind of line up with the scoring criteria. And so the purpose of this, just to give you a little background, is, we were thinking, how can we get a sense of an organization without knowing the full project that they're going to be doing around how they'd be able to deliver the project. And so this is really where we're looking for past projects, staff anecdotes, other pieces around how your organization works that can speak to these pieces. So those are the 6 criteria there. And then looking at the following questions, asking number 8, what existing high school student programming your organization might be interested in supporting. Question 9, are there any new high school projects that you'd be interested in having funding? And both are allowed through this grant project. And then lastly, 10, a couple of references that we could get in touch with. And if your organization has done high school programming in specific, it would be great to have references specifically for that work. And then question 11 is just if you have any additional resources. We were thinking project websites or student work, and you can just attach that on the end. We said no more than five pages of anything else that kind of gives a flavor of the high school work or Safe Routes to School work that your organization has done. So that's a little high level summary. Let me go back to, we can talk a little bit about the selection criteria. Wait, I think I get so good at Zoom at doing this so often. All right, give me a moment. Okay. All right. So I was just going to walk through for people to see, these are the 6 criteria that are within the questions of the letter of interest, but are also the main scoring criteria. And this is laid out in even more detail as a resource on the high school grant page. But I just wanted to walk through what would be full points for each of those 6 criteria. So the first one that the project team will be looking at is potential reach. And for full points, that would be showing how your organization can deliver what we're calling a multi-tiered strategy that reaches students at different levels. And so an example of that would be working with a student leadership team very deeply that's involved in planning, and maybe they're planning a larger school-wide event that reaches many more 100 people, but more broadly, and reaching those students obviously less deeply than the, 6 or 10 people that are in the student leadership group. So that's an example for potential reach and that multi-tiered strategy approach. For student leadership engagement, it's looking at how the applicant and organization has engaged student leaders deeply within project planning and implementation. So that would be something that would get an organization full points. Then potential mode shift, talking about how past or proposed activities would have a direct impact on mode shift. That's one of the goals of the Spare the Air Youth program. The next criteria is around engaging underserved youth. And I think in the past we have used specifically the free and reduced price meal as like an indicator of which school you're working with and what their level of FRPM was. But we've just shifted this more broadly so that the applicant can talk about, the equity framework that they bring to their program implementation and any existing relationships with students that they want to particularly call out. So making that definition a little broader. The next criteria is around ability to deliver on time and within budget. And so definitely looking for similar projects of similar budgets and time spans and talking about how you've executed that successfully. And then the last piece definitely fits in with our new task forces and thinking about aligning these with county or regional priorities, but talking about how your program aligns with larger regional or Bay Area Safe Routes to School priorities. So that's the 6 criteria and what would get you full points. I'll just take a moment here in case anyone has any questions with this piece before I move on. Okay, great. And just the final piece of information is just talking through the grant schedule and kind of a look ahead. So here we are in May, almost June. The request for letter of interest for the high school grant program is open. And then, as I said, the deadline for submission is June 8th at 10 p.m. And that's the deadline before which you'll want to submit as a Word or PDF document that letter of interest. So as I said, late June will be the time when all the scoring will happen. And the project team will make the decision on the final grant recipients. And then in July will be the month that the grant recipients are notified, and they'll work with Alta Planning to get under contract. And then August, September, beginning of the next school year, that's when the grant recipients will already be under contract, and within their within that project work, they can start to define what their project scope and budget will look like. And that will be working with both the Spare the Air Youth, the project team, MTC and Alta, and then also some of the relevant task force members. And then the look ahead, 2021 through 2022-23 school years, so the next 2 to 3 years will be the implementation time and that final funding cycle for the high school grant program. I think I saw, Anna, is there a question in the chat?
Yeah, one question, just asking if this is formally a program of Safe Routes to School.
I can answer that, Beth, if you want. So it's not a formal Safe Routes to School program. Our intent is to expand Safe Routes to School program like programming to high schools. So it's not formally Safe Routes. If you have other great ideas that are completely unrelated to Safe Routes, but it helps us, reach more high school students and specifically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then we want to hear from you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think some of our funded organizations in the past have delivered more typical like Safe Routes to School programs. And then I'm thinking about the organization Earth Team. I think they're on the phone, who've been funded over the last 2 years, and they're not officially Safe Routes to School, but kind of work at the intersection of air quality, alternative transportation, and climate change. So yeah, that's a great question. So this is the end of, I think, the formal presentation, but just wanted to open it up if people have questions. And I think some of the things that I've seen, the questions I've seen come in through email would be helpful for other people to hear as well. So if you do have a question, feel free to offer it to the group.
One more question, Beth, is could you go back over the total amount of funding available?
Yeah, I don't think I actually said that. So the total amount of funding available is $280,000. So that would be the entire amount to be split over the 2 to 3 year funding cycle. So I see a question from Eleanor around supporting collaborations between organizations and how would you recommend they apply? I think that's a great question. I know that other organizations and areas might be doing the same. And so to do that, you would just have to designate one organization to be the funding recipient, and then figure out how other organizations would contract with that recipient to get and distribute the project money. Leslie, I don't know if you have clarifications on that. We haven't seen it in the past, but it's definitely something that could work for this program.
Yeah, we'd have to discuss the details because the insurance and contracting requirements that apply to the sub under ALTA would apply to the sub under the other, or whoever the partner organizations are. But there are other ways to maybe pay. So we would have to discuss the details separately on how that could work. But we can certainly make it work.
Great. I see a question from Nicole. If we're applying for the full amount available, is it presumed this will be for a 3-year program? Could the $50K be used for a 2-year program? And the short answer is yes, it could be used for a 2-year program. The 3-year is, not to get into technicalities, but we're allowed a 1-year extension. So that would just be, and we saw this with other high school grant programs, is it's hard to close out all the work in 1 year. And the same thing with a 2-year program. If it's hard to close out and finish all that relationship work in the 2 years, we're giving people kind of an option to extend into the 3rd year. So it'd be, yeah, so the $50K would be allowed for a 2-year program. Great. Any other questions that are coming up for people? Okay, so I see a couple questions. One from Lauren: is it preferred that the same schools are served over the 2 to 3 years or different schools each school year? Because I hadn't thought about that. In the past, it's been the organization either picks like one or a couple schools to work with. So there's definitely no requirement to be serving different students in different years. And I think logistically it could be easier to pick a couple schools and stick with them over the couple of years just so you have time to build relationships with the students. But there are no set guidelines around that. And then I see a question from Matt that the $30,000 to $50,000 over the course of 2 years. Oh, that's a good question. And now I'm questioning my own math of 2080K.
Yeah, I think what we were envisioning was a maximum $50,000 grant per organization. So it wouldn't be year over year. And then I also want to go back to the previous question from Lauren. And I don't think we clearly indicated what the regional priorities are. And also keep in mind that we're going to be working with you. Like, you can have a rough draft of the program you think you want to implement, but we will working with you to kind of work out the details. But going back to the regional priorities, we do want, what we're looking for are programs that can be easily scaled to the regional level. So if you have a great idea for a program that works at a school, and it can be easily replicated if for some reason we find funding in the future where we can take that idea and implement it region-wide. Then that would be something that we'd want to do. Yeah, I think I'll just go back to. Yeah, so if you want to focus, on just 1 or 2 schools for the life of this specific grant, that's completely fine. But then again, keep in mind that what we are looking for are things that are scalable, and that would work in all of the 9 counties of the Bay Area.
Great. Yeah, that's a great clarification. I'm just going to read through a couple other questions from Susie. Is training for staff instructors eligible? Yes, it is. That is something that could be funded through CMAQ funding. So it's not incentives or giveaways to students, but it's training for staff that are part of the grant applicants. So yes, that is eligible. Jose, at the end, could I discuss equity issues with online learning? That would be excellent. Yeah, maybe after we get through the questions, I could turn it over to you and maybe you can talk about some of the things that you've been thinking with the City of Palo Alto. From Christopher, can you speak a little bit more about the regional task forces? Is that role primarily about recipient selection and then collaborating on project design, or will it be ongoing over the course of the grant? Oh, that's a really good question. So I think the quick answer is it's the former. So the role of the task force members is around guiding and being an advisor to the scoring of the applications. And then we'll also offer them an opportunity to work with the selected project applicants to kind of guide what the project looks like. But there's no requirements from that moment on for the applicants to keep in conversation with the task force members. The task force members will continue to meet, but they won't have any direction on the project after that initial piece.
And the county task force members are just so that we keep in line with the county's priorities.
Okay, just looking through the questions. So Glenn just asks for the task forces, does the funding cover staffing of those people? No. So that's outside of the 280K, or that's not funded through this program. So they are either volunteering their time or working in their capacity as a Safe Routes to School administrator to assist with this program. And then I see just a comment from Kevin around the current school situation being so up in the air right now. Can mode shift include other kinds of trips besides to and from school? I think so. I don't know, Leslie, if you have other thoughts on this. I think it's within the program's kind of vision.
Yeah, honestly, anything that changes societal behavior in the future, I think is completely eligible. So if you're working to teach kids that, when they graduate from high school, they don't have to drive a car, that's totally fine. We're more, so we do want to see mode shift, but we also want to see just cultural change around transportation.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll just pass it over to Jose. You said you wanted to just say a few thoughts on kind of equity considerations and e-learning.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, so kind of the things we're discovering, at least in Palo Alto, and working with our partners in the region, is just how some programs, they're running into an issue where when it comes to either canceling because of shelter in place, you can't, have a group of teaching certain people now unless it's like deemed essential. So like Rosie and I were just thinking of ways in which, they recently, at least in Santa Clara, county said like car parades are okay. So I'm trying to figure out like how can we make, you know, Safe Routes to School like coordinator of the activities that certain groups do, as well as being deemed essential, to lift that up and to just make sure that these groups are included, because we're seeing an increase in, you know, bike purchases. We're also seeing an increase in using bikes, and especially an increase in students and even adults. So the thing there is just trying to figure out to kind of work together, maybe as a region, figuring that out, but it's just something to think about. But also the reason I bring that up is because when it comes to some of the work we're doing, especially for me, the City of Palo Alto is working with a group called, with PEAUSD, the School District of Palo Alto. There's a group called the Family Engagement Specialist, who works with disadvantaged family or communities. And there are some families within the community that do not have certain access to the internet. For example, the school district is able to give internet to these groups, but usually they are not able to connect that internet, and they're not able to get all the learning they need. So you know, all the online platform that we're trying to do, there are some families who do not have access to that, or have no idea how to like navigate to using that type of information and sharing it. So I'm trying to figure out ways to kind of connect different ways, either through flyers or through other forms of communication. But then again, there are some families as well that, you know, the language barrier is definitely there, and kind of even reading can be challenging for some families as well, which, you know, I'm just trying to figure out ways. And I think San Mateo County has come up with Alta Planning some sort of flyers that not only let the county and those who live within the county know what to do with social distancing, but also graphically shows families as well, and those who are reading, what social distancing might look like. So there's just a great way of communicating that. So I just kind of wanted to bring that up, lift that up, and just have everybody, you know, remind everybody when it comes to putting these applications together, to keep that in mind, that some families might not have access to the internet, and to just be a little bit more creative. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. I think those are really good points. Yeah, and I think I've heard from other program providers that these, you know, equity issues around internet and who has good connections to internet, and just kind of like changing communication modes is definitely on people's mind. This is a good reminder for people. I know a lot of people on the phone are already part of the Spare the Air Youth, the advisory committee that meets like 4 times a year. But the upcoming meeting is June 16th, and I know we'll have a space to talk about some of these transitions to e-learning and, you know, using online webinars instead of in person. And so if you're not already part of this conversation and you want to be, I think that would also be a good place to kind of follow up on some of these ideas today that you're bringing to the table. So if you would like to be part of that, feel free to email me, and I can add you to the list for the next June 16th meeting. All right. Are there any other questions? I'll just give you, so just the next steps. We'll post this recording on the website, and I'll send a follow-up with this link also to everyone who registered for the event today. And feel free to, as I said, email myself, Beth Martin at altaplanning.com, if you have any follow-up questions around eligibility, and I'll loop Leslie and the rest of the project team in on that conversation. But otherwise, thank you so much for listening in, and really looking forward to reviewing the applications. Have a great afternoon.